Okay, everybody. Thank you for coming to this Lunch and Learn session. We're going to be doing AI email generated attack prevention. It's an interesting topic. I think what makes it unique is that it is a native AI product. So, unlike where you see out there, and for CSA Delaware Valley, this is our goal this year is to not look at the bolted on products that we are seeing crop up everywhere, but to look at a native AI product. So I'll introduce myself. Hello, my name is Ben Levin. I'm the president of the Cloud Security Alliance at Delaware Valley, or as we like to call it internally, CSADV. I would like to welcome everyone to our lunch and learn focused on native artificial intelligence. Support from companies like Strongest Layer help our nonprofit continue offering meaningful programming, education, and advocacy programs throughout the year. We thank Strongest Layer for helping us reach our annual fundraising goals. Now, about today's presentation. Strongest Layer has emerged as one of the most AI native cybersecurity platforms in the 25-26 market, purpose built to encounter the surge of AI generated phishing and business email compromise. Unlike legacy security tools that rely on signatures or static rules, Strongest Layer uses advanced large language models, or that, to understand email context, intent, tone, and behavioral anomalies in real time. So that's the most important thing. And now some housekeeping rules. This event is being recorded, as I'm sure you already heard, and will be available for rewatch up to 30 days via a link that will be sent to all registered participants after the session is over, within 2 days, I should say. A continuing education certificate will be issued for those within 2 weeks of all participants who attend this Zoom for 35 minutes. So Zoom has a great way of timing how long you're on the call, and 35 minutes. And lastly, we will allow all participants to ask questions at the end, and you can put them in if you really have something stronger to get in. Um, um, but to ask participation questions at the end of the presentation via chat. We will wait to the end. So you could do it during, I'm going to change my rules since I have people monitoring the chat from Strongest Layer in addition to myself. You could do it during there. We'll keep a log of it. But if you want to wait till the end, I'll keep an eye on it too. Let me give you a little bit of information about our speaker today. Alan LaForte is our speaker today. He's a veteran in cybersecurity leader with more than 15 years of expertise and experience in building and scaling enterprise security products trusted by Fortune 500 organizations. He has led major product and business units at Proofpoint, McAfee, and Intel Security, driving innovation in advanced threat protection, insider risk, and behavioral analytics. At Intel, Alan shaped global product strategy across the US, Europe, and Israel, guiding cross-regional teams in bringing new security capabilities to market. Now, as CEO of Strongest Layer, he is channeling his deep enterprise expertise into stopping AI-powered phishing attacks before they reach users, redefining what email security looks like in the new AI era, which was becoming the AI era. And now I will hand the controls over to our co-host, Alan, to begin the Lunch and Learn presentation. Alan, it's your show.
Thanks, Ben. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining me today for this CSA Delaware Valley webinar. Now, how many of you have ever held a really good fake Rolex? And I don't mean the kind you buy on a beach in Cancun for like 40 bucks. I mean the kinds that would make a jeweler pause. The kind where you flip it over and the movement is actually Swiss. The crystal is real sapphire. The bracelet is 904L steel, the same alloy that Rolex actually uses. Every single component is genuine, sourced from similar suppliers, assembled with real craftsmanship. The only thing that's actually fake is the crown on the dial and the person selling it to you. That's the state of phishing in 2026. The emails hitting your inbox right now are built from real parts, real SendGrid accounts, real Cloudflare captchas, real Google redirects, real Microsoft domains. Every component used to pass inspection. And your security tools look at each part and say, this is legitimate, because each part is legitimate. And the only thing that's fake is the intent and the sender. I'm Alan Lafort, CEO of Strongest Layer, as you know. And our founding team comes from Proofpoint, Google and Mandiant, FireEye, McAfee. So we've spent our career building the detection systems I'm about to show you the limits of. And that's not a criticism of those companies. It's an acknowledgement that the threat has outgrown the architecture. So for the next 35 minutes or so, I'm going to walk you through what we're seeing in real enterprise traffic email, and why the detection models most of us rely on were never designed for a change in the threat environment we're seeing, and that a fundamentally different approach is needed. And we'll show you what that looks like. So whether you're running a SOC or you're making budget decisions about what goes in your stack, my hope is to give you a framework for evaluating what's actually working and what isn't. And when it's all done, I'll have a bit of time to address your questions. And as you heard earlier, if you have questions and they're just interesting, drop them in the chat. We have folks that are monitoring, and we'll happily ask them midway. And I don't mind being interrupted to keep this lively. So, all right, let's start off with what today is about. We analyzed 5,000 real attacks. Every one of them bypassed at least one of the top three enterprise secure email gateways. Not sampled, not triaged. Every alert analyzed end to end with full reasoning, the way a human analyst would look at it. And we used live traffic on M365, on Google Workspace, and we looked at a data set across 2 months. And one thing you need to understand is that whenever we integrate our solution or our technology, it's often behind one of these technologies because we connect with a Graph API. So as we connect through that API to emails that have just been delivered, if we can read them and they are malicious, by definition, those got through. And so that's the body of alerts that we analyzed. And when we looked at it, here's what really surprised us. We had a thesis that the biggest threat was going to be AI-generated personalization, that everyone would get spear-phished automatically, and it would be harder to detect those. Or perhaps deepfakes or other types of new attacks would be what was most prevalent. And that's not what we found. What we found was what I want to call structural evasion by design. Attackers aren't just writing better emails. They aren't just personalizing messages. They're personalizing kill chains. They're engineering bespoke paths through your entire security stack. And that's a level of sophistication the market hasn't been predicting yet. It's certainly not priced in yet in terms of how we think about where we protect. So what do we mean by a personalized kill chain? What does that actually look like? So we mapped 22 distinct evasion techniques across 5 categories when we look through these 5,000 alerts. And when we looked at the combinations of these 22 evasion techniques across these 5 categories, 1,400 unique attack combinations in our data set of 5,000 alerts. More than a third were each structurally different. So let's walk you through those 5 families. First one, channel shifting. 36% of attacks had these techniques. This is the one that should scare you the most because the malicious action moves off the email entirely. Either they're asking for a phone call back, or it's through a QR code, or a voicemail pivot, or a Microsoft Teams pivot. And the goal is that your email infrastructure for defense isn't just defeated, it's not structurally relevant because there's nothing to scan. The email is clean because the attack happens somewhere else. The second category, URL evasion. 65% use this evasion technique where you have legitimate site redirects. So, using something like Google to redirect to something else, which we call legitimate service abuse, what researchers also call LOTs, or CAPTCHA gates, or multi-hop redirects where it's the third or fourth or fifth URL that is bad. So the URL might start with DocuSign.com or SharePoint.com, but then it redirects and it's in the final 3 hops that you get a CAPTCHA, and therefore they can control what you can scan versus what you can't. So a lot of sophistication there. Content evasion, 42%, right? So spoofing notifications, putting things in PDF attachments, hiding your HTML, doing HTML smuggling, putting things in image-based payloads. They're all designed to look benign to a machine using rules looking for patterns, but still be perfectly readable to a human eye. The next category, authentication evasion, 58%. And that is domain lookalikes, subdomain abuse, compromised accounts, bypassing SPF or DKIM, as authentication, and not because they're spoofed, but because the attacker owns the sending infrastructure. It is legitimate. And then finally, the one we all know at 78%, social engineering, where authority impersonation, financial lures, or impersonating a brand with techniques of urgency and scarcity, and where the vocabulary is now identical to legitimate business email and hard to stop. But here's the number that matters. As impressive as all these techniques are and how they're used, this is the scariest part. 57% of the attacks we looked at used 4 or more of these techniques simultaneously. The average is 4.11 techniques per attack. And combination attacks of this type, when we looked at our data set, are up 130% over Q4. So they're not picking a technique. They're actually using these techniques to engineer a path through your defenses.
So Alan, I'll ask you a question. Is this because the attacker is using AI to build a better attack profile into systems via email?
Absolutely. And I'll touch on this in a little bit, but we've even seen evidence that they're profiling the target infrastructure. So the attacks being used on Google Workspace are somewhat different than the ones that are being tried on Microsoft Office and Defender, because they know the weak points of each and they tailor their techniques. So we're definitely seeing there's a proactive understanding of the environment and a tailoring, not just of the content, but the attack strategy itself. And that is the scariest part.
So once they get into this network, are they then have you seen in terms of your LLM models what the damage or profile is, so to speak? So we know that what you put up here on the slide shows how they're coming in with the technique, but then do you look also past that in terms of when they get in there, what do you see happen when you ran your LLMs on that?
Yeah, what's interesting is the reason we're able to pull this perspective together, the thing that connects it all is we look at every email from a standpoint of what's its intent, right? And in that intent, we can get into things like, you know, what are they trying to accomplish? What's the harm if they succeed, to your question? And are there anomalies or deceptive techniques that together with that intent would allow us to confidently say, this is a malicious attack and we need to stop it. So we definitely, think and reason through those things in the LLM. And it's what allows us to see these disparate, seemingly disconnected techniques and thread what's going on. And I'll show some examples of that in coming slides. But a great question. All right. So now I'm not going to read you all 20.
Alan, I'm
Yes.
sorry. I just want to. Jeffrey asked a question. I forgot to unmute myself. How does strongest layer identify vendor business email compromise and email attacks? I'm sure you'll get to this, but that was one of the questions that.
Yeah, I actually
dropped.
will. I actually have an example that walks through it on a slide. So, Jeffrey, that's a great example. And business email compromise are typically difficult because they don't have a URL, they don't have an attachment. And so they've been a thorn in the side of email because they're built on detecting bad URLs and bad attachments and less about policing words. So we'll talk about how an LLM is obviously, it's a large language model and it does really well on BEC attacks. And we'll talk about the evolution of the traditional BEC attack, which I'll give a couple examples of, like, for example, DocuSign impersonations, I think is a great example of they're trying to compromise the business, but they are using URLs and other techniques. Okay, so I got to read you all these 22 techniques on the slide. And they're on the slide. They'll be in the research we're publishing. It's a good screenshot if you want it. But I do want you to notice one thing. If you look at the top of each column, the most common techniques, authority impersonation at 65%, domain lookalikes at 56%, legitimate redirects at 43, or financial lures at 44. Every single one of those uses legitimate infrastructure to operate. And let me double click on what I mean by that. You can't write a rule to block the word DocuSign if your business uses it for its contracts. If your document management is SharePoint.com, you can't blacklist, I should say, SharePoint.com. You can't flag the words please review and sign as malicious language because they're legitimately used. So going back to the Rolex, the parts are real, right? Every technique on this slide was observed in production enterprise email in that data set we look like. So quick question for the chat. Of those 5 categories I just walked through, which ones are you seeing most in your environment, today? If are you seeing them go off channel? Are you seeing, more advanced URL evasion or social engineering? Curious
So,
what you're dealing with day
so
to day.
Jeffrey chimed in that he was a big advocate of the DocuSign, tax.
Okay. Let's see. All right, yeah. So that one is actually very interesting. And we got a couple cases on the DocuSign impersonations I want to take you through. I'm not trying to do a commercial on this, but we had a customer that literally had a DocuSign breach prior to us being, a technology for them. And that was the criteria is can you stop these impersonations because they're everywhere? We ran a POC and I think we found like 19 in 10 days. And obviously they're now a customer, but the reason we're able to, I'm decoding through this research exactly how we've been able to see those and why, and we'll go through some examples. The QR code, phone callback, also very interesting, ones that we see. In fact, the Toad, I think, was the number one in our study, was like 27% of these attacks were Toad attacks, which is telephone-oriented attack delivery. QR codes as well, we're seeing a lot of creativity there. And
And
the voice.
wait, I'll just interject. I assume that, because of my naivete, is that I assume that those code attacks that you're seeing is because with the ability to fake voices today with AI, they're able to drive those kind of attack vectors.
Yeah, and I think the goal, the payoff is to get you to listen. Yeah, the SMS pivot is a challenging one, Miranda. In that that you just don't. It's hard to observe, and unfortunately, the mobile companies have made it difficult to the mobile OS providers, I would say, to secure their infrastructure. So yeah, that one's definitely a tough one. Yes, says so. Jeffrey asked, have we detected calendar invite emails? Yes, we do detect those. And that's more of an architecture thing in that SMTP is what a traditional email gateway looks at, and calendar invites are more API driven, so it can be a blind spot. But for API based solutions, it's not. So we do detect them quite frequently as in our attack set. Okay, well, that was really helpful, and I think it aligns with a lot of what we've seen in our research. So let's look at let me get to the next slide here. So the reason these things work, and I think it's important to know why these evasion techniques were chosen, and it really maps to kind of the 6 layers you have as defense, right? So layer 1 is authentication. That's are you enforcing DMARC, DKIM, SPF, or reputation filtering? Layer 3, you've got URL sandbox and content scanning. You often have some neurolinguistic stuff for content and policy to catch word patterns, and then you've got kind of human judgment, your user deciding where to click, call, reply, ignore. And then layer 6 is I think when the attack leaves the plane entirely, and so that's just getting off of email to all these things we talked about in chat. Um, you know what we're seeing is that modern attacks don't try and punch through one layer and hope for the best. They're trying to defeat all 6 systematically, and that each technique in the chain is purpose-built to neutralize a specific layer, right? Domain lookalikes defeat authentication. Legitimate redirects defeat reputation. CAPTCHA gates defeat sandboxing. Brand impersonation defeats NLP because the attack looks identical to a real notification. Social engineering defeats the human because it uses the same urgency language your real business partners use. And channel shifting, it makes your stack structurally irrelevant because you don't have full ability to observe. And that means 36% of attacks just go away. They go off camera. Now, when 36% of attacks just leave, what does that mean? It means the email is clean. The attack happens on a phone call, in a Teams chat, or in a mobile device scanning a QR code. Your SEG can't see it. So no single rule, no single detection layer catches the full chain because the chain was designed to defeat each of those checks one at a time.
Can I interject a question? And the question is, would organizations with a good DMARC, SPF, and DKIM records configuration setup prevent most of these attacks?
That's a great question. Jeffrey, I think you need to join our company. You're telling our story better than we are. Yeah, absolutely. What we found in the data was that about 78% of these attacks had perfectly clean DMARC, SPF, DKIM records because of the using of trusted infrastructure, right? And so I think we often forget in this SaaS world, criminals can get credit cards and go and rent infrastructure that comes in as legitimate. And there's a lot of that, right? This is again that weaponizing of the supply chain. So even though those records come in clean, the attacks are coming in on clean domains. Now, speaking of those attacks, this slide up here where we say, you can read it, but the x-axis is the number of techniques stacked in a single attack. The blue bar shows volume, what percentage of attacks use that many techniques, and the pink line is bypass probability. In other words, as they stack these techniques, will they make it through the traditional, email protection that's out there today? And if you look at that, like watch what happens to that pink line. At one technique, bypass probability is low. That's the world your SEG was built for. But only 6.6% of the attacks in our data set live there anymore. Single technique attacks are basically if they're not extinct, they will be because they're just easy to block today. At 3 techniques, though, you're at a 60% bypass. At 40 techniques, and that's where the bulk of attacks live, that's the tall red bar in the middle, you're approaching 80% bypass. And just look at the volume there. And that red shading means high volume and high bypass at the same time. That's really the danger zone. And then at 8 or more techniques, as crazy as that sounds, you have a 99% bypass probability. Each technique is not just, additional technique doesn't just add risk, it multiplies it. That compounding is nonlinear. Attackers aren't personalizing emails, they're personalizing kill chains. And every technique they stack makes the chain exponentially harder to catch with rules.
So I'll interject something real quick here. So you're looking beyond, so you're looking in totality of all the threats, and some of the other things that I've seen look at the user themselves behavior. Do you look at both, or how do you view, I mean, obviously your LLM's looking at the user's behavior, but in a live environment, is there any pickups of what's going on too from the user?
Yeah, so there's always a tension in email security of how much do you want to track the user to protect them versus their privacy. So we tend to be privacy first, but I would say what is normal for an organization, in terms of I think generally there's a lot of commonality of what's normal for business. Then there's what's normal for your industry and your business, and then there's what's normal for the individual. Over time, our reasoning engine is really good without storing anything about the individual, and I don't want to get into protected IP of us getting to those levels of knowing so that when we say, is this anomalous or not, there's some baseline information that helps us figure that out, or patterns. And I think that's one part of it, right? So there's that, is this anomalous to what's considered normal? Then, and some of that can be as simple as, have these people ever conversed before, and you can see it on an email thread. Like, is there a send receive pair, right? So that's a simple check. Or it can be, is this vendor ever conversed with this organization, right? And you can kind of see that in the bulk email patterns on the domain. So there's a lot of ways for us to bring in context at the point of analysis that helps us determine that something just doesn't fit. So hopefully did that answer the question well?
Yes.
Wonderful. Now, this slide, I think is just really showing what we mean by some of these attacks and how they're stacked. So, first let me look at 3 actual kill chains from the data set. So first, the DocuSign plus Toad hybrid. So it starts with brand impersonation, looks exactly like a DocuSign notification, pixel perfect. It defeats your authentication layer. Then your authority impersonation, it claims to be from your CFO. The language is identical to a real executive email, which defeats, any language analysis. Then there's a legitimate redirect, sadly, sometimes from DocuSign.com itself, because, it's effectively a hosting platform, where your sandbox follows the link, lands on a real DocuSign page, says all clear, then the kill shot, goes from email to a phone to a callback number. Then the attack is off the email plane entirely, and you don't have any visibility anymore, where you have 4 techniques, each one defeats a different detection layer, and no single rule will catch that full chain. The second example is a QR plus CAPTCHA plus redirect. This one was targeting Google Workspace. A QR code means there's no URL in the email body, so automated scanners see nothing to detonate. Behind the QR is a CAPTCHA gate that blocks sandboxes, and then there's multi-hop redirects till you get to the final credfish, that would happen off that. And so again, all of this is designed to evade the detection chain. And then the third one we're seeing a lot is, PDFs with HTML smuggling, where the malicious payload is assembled inside the victim's browser, never exists as a file on the wire. Your security tools would just generally not see it. And then here's an interesting stat. There's actually a 0% sort of overlap between the QR variant and the DocuSign variant, because the rule that catches one can't even see the other. And the other thing that was really scary to us of these evasion techniques being stacked was that over 80% of these attacks use combinations outside the 10 most common patterns. In other words, there is a long tail, which would make it impossible, as these continue to evolve and you add personalization, to keep up with rules, because the combinatorial space of all these different permutations is just too large and crazy. So here is where we, think it gets very personalized, where attackers aren't spraying and praying and they're optimizing per platform. We actually looked and said, are the threats that are being used different between 2 platforms? And you can see on the categories, they're generally kind of similar. QR codes, 98% bypass on M365, 96 on Google Workspace. Neither platform has a URL to scan. Phone callbacks are 99% on both. Nothing for the platforms to analyze. But when we look at the targeting, every single DocuSign impersonation was against an M365 environment. Not so much on Google Workspace. There was 7 times more brand impersonation on M365, because that's where DocuSign and Microsoft lures work best. Meanwhile, on Google Workspace, we saw 3 times the payload delivery on redirect heavy techniques. And we think that's because Defender's E3 and above stricter URL scanning pushes attackers towards chains that are more optimized for Google Workspace. So what we take from this, attackers are now not just studying your people, they're studying your stack. They know what Defender's good at. They know what Google scanning misses. They know where Mimecast is strongest, or Proofpoint is strongest or weakest, and they're building for that environment. And that's what we mean when we say personalizing kill chains. It's not better grammar, it's not AI written rules. These are these bespoke evasion architectures engineered for your platform. Okay. If there's one slide I want you to remember when we wrap this webinar, it's this one. Here's an example where we have the same attack, DocuSign impersonation, legitimate redirect through DocuSign.com. There's a CAPTCHA gate. There's a credential harvest. There's some authority impersonation plus a financial lure, targeting someone on an M365 tenant. We're going to look at how these three detection approaches look at this exact same email, but come out with three very different answers. So let's start with regular expressions or looking for patterns, the traditional, probably first generation approach. It's going to check authentication, looking at SPF, DKIM, DMARC. They're all going to pass. It's going to check the URL. It's going to land on DocuSign.com, no malicious indicator, checks the content, no keywords flag, standard notification template. The verdict, clean, gets delivered to the inbox, no alerts on the console. Then let's look at machine learning, the next gen approach off of regexes. It's going to notice a few things. It's going to say, hey, wait a minute, that sending domain is 7 days old, or there is no prior sending history. The redirect chain goes to 3 hops behind a CAPTCHA, and no peers in the organization have received similar DocuSign requests in the last 30 days, right? So it's going to look for those behavioral patterns. So it's going to, but it's not going to have enough confidence to call it malicious, so it's going to flag it as suspicious. So it's flagged, but it isn't automatically blocked. So it's going to generate a medium confidence alert. And in most SOCs that are overwhelmed, let's be honest, most are, you're going to have a medium confidence alert on a DocuSign notification that's probably not going to get reviewed unless it's escalated by someone waiting for that for a DocuSign. So it's functionally the same as clean because it's not actionable and it requires a lot of investigation to perhaps flag it as a false positive. Which brings us to reasoning, which is the approach that we've taken with LLMs at the center. It's going to read the email that you would if you had unlimited time and full context. And it asks, why is a 7-day-old domain sending a DocuSign notification claiming to be CFO writing through 3 redirects behind a CAPTCHA when no one else in the organization has received anything similar in the last month? It evaluates the intent. It then sees the urgency language. It sees the anomalous impersonation. It looks at all the context, holds off judgment till the very end, and then it says, this is clearly malicious. Let's block it, and then let's autonomously complete the investigation for the analyst. So let's talk about what this means for your current security posture. Your email gateway, your email protection you have today, it's not failing, and I want to be clear about that. It's succeeding, but unfortunately, it's now succeeding at the wrong problem. If you look at the columns up above here, starting with, actually blocked, about 99% of commodity attacks are actually blocked. Known bad URLs, malicious attachments, blacklisted domains, they're the easy ones. And this is what your vendor's detection rate metric measures. When they say they have 99 point something % catch rate, it's for these bulk attacks, known good, based on reputation and patterns. For advanced, what I would call AI-assisted attacks, their catch rate is much lower, at about 20%, because of the structural evasion techniques I shared earlier. So, and then further to that, 44% of detections are now caught in what I call the false positive trap. They're flagged as suspicious, but not blocked. So you're generating these lower confidence alerts that your security team will actually learn to ignore over time. And alert fatigue isn't an accident. It's actually a designed outcome. Attackers know that suspicious is functionally the same as clean in most security operations. And then perhaps most troubling again, 36% are structurally invisible because they have no signature, they have no URL, no attachment to scan. The email is clean. The attack happens on a phone, behind a QR code in a mobile browser. So your vendor's not lying to you, but the metric they're reporting doesn't reflect the threat you're actually facing. Because in that 1 to 0.1% is where all the risk lies. All right. Now, this is a slide that I think should make every security leader a bit uncomfortable. If you think about your email protection infrastructure, it basically, as if you have a gateway, and everyone does, because you have one with Microsoft that comes with it, you have one with Google that comes with it on top of what you add, but it gives you a dial. And you block everything on one end, allow everything on the other, and you got to find the sweet spot in the middle. But attackers have made the dial a trap. If you looking on the left, you can tighten detection. You can block DocuSign lookalikes, and 23% of your legitimate contract notifications get quarantined. Legal workflows halt. And then eventually you're forced to loosen the rule in 48 hours because the business needs to operate. If you flag domains under 30 days old, you make a mess of new vendor onboarding break, and you break that, and then procurement escalates. IT opens an exception. The exception becomes permanent. Attackers know this. They register domains and wait 31 days, right? Then you got the right side. Do you loosen detection? Well, if you do that, then DocuSign impersonation sails right through because SPF passed, DKIM passed, and then it redirects to the real DocuSign.com. So then credential harvests complete with no alerts. And those credential harvests, were delivered to inbox. And the needle is stuck in the middle, and that's where attackers want it. They calibrate their techniques to just sit below the threshold where blocking them would break your business. And so the consequence is you can't tune your way out of this because the dial is the problem. So the answer isn't better rules. It's not better ML, because when the parts are all real, the only way to detect is to focus on intent. And detecting intent requires reasoning. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. I mentioned at the top of our call that, this webinar, that our team comes from Proofpoint, Mandiant, FireEye, McAfee. Each of us spent time building those detection and response systems. We built strongest layer because we all reached this conclusion that the threat with AI is going to outgrow the architecture that we helped create. So about us, just to provide a little context, we're an API-based solution that deploys alongside your existing infrastructure, Microsoft or Google, equally in about 15 minutes. There's no rip and replace. Your current technology can stay in place, and we reason about what it doesn't catch. Now, 3 things to know about us. In terms of what we do, we're really good at catching all attacks, but specifically the ones built from legitimate components, which is everything I've shown you for the last 30 minutes or so. And we do it with 95% fewer false positives so that your analysts focus on real threats instead of triaging noise. Now, how do we do it? Well, we're LLM native, not machine learning or other language model techniques bolted onto a rules engine pipeline. Our reasoning agent investigates every alert where it gathers evidence, context, and then reasons about the intent, the anomaly, the deception, and the harm, both through a personal and organizational context, and then at the end delivers a verdict. So the question that we ask isn't, does this match a known attack? The question that it asks is, does this email make sense for the business? And if every attack is soon going to be unique through personalization and through attack chain variance, the odds of finding a known attack are less, but the odds of using intent to figure out if it's good or bad are very high. What makes us different as well, and this is for the security leaders on the call, and these things tend to matter when we get to procurement, is that we have full explainability. Every verdict comes with the complete reasoning chain, not a score. We do autonomous investigation of every alert put in the console, including the medium confidence ones others tend to ignore, so that everything is, triage ready. And we do it with zero training of LLMs, and we have what we call a zero memory architecture. No LLM will retain any customer or email content ever. It's never trained on your data. And so for DPA conversations, privacy, that's a meaningful distinction that many vendors have not yet solved. And, we made it the core of how we operate. So let me just finally end on a slide that shows this reasoning in action on the attack we've been following. Same attack, DocuSign impersonation, a legitimate redirect, a CAPTCHA gate, a credential harvest, with authority and financial lure targeting an M365 tenant. You saw how regex says that's clean and ML says suspicious. Now let's just dive into the reasoning engine. Step one, what do we know about the sender? Doesn't just check if authentication passes. It asks who is the sender. What do we know about the domain? Is there prior sending history with this organization? It claims to be the CFO. Does that look like what we've seen from the CFO before? It's not a red flag for regex. Authentication would pass, but we would flag it as, okay, this doesn't seem right. Step two, what is the intent? The language says signature required or access revoked. That's urgency combined with authority. Reasoning maps this to a financial lure technique, not because the words are flagged. Your legitimate vendors use the same language, but because the combination of that urgency and the authority claim and the financial action is a known manipulation approach. Then, it goes, another agent kicks off and does a full analysis of the chain from DocuSign.com, which is cleared by the regex, to then go through the next three hops to eventually get to a CAPTCHA gate that blocks the automated scanning to an unknown destination. It sees the evasion architecture, not just the first hop. Then there's the organizational context. No one else in the organization has received a similar DocuSign request in 30 days that has that same sort of header configuration. No existing relationship with the sender. The reason you can use that organizational context to assess whether this communication is expected. And this is not something you can't easily do with a rule-based system. It requires you to understand the business and the context, not just the single email. And then step five, getting to the verdict with high confidence by holding back judgment until we have all the pieces together versus having a serial pipeline that says, did the URL match? No. Okay. Did this match? No. Okay. Did this match? No. Okay. Let it through. But collecting these as individual pieces of evidence to then weigh at the end, like a judge would in the court, that's what allows us to have that high confidence verdict. Where we're like, this doesn't make sense, right? And the reasoning says, does a 7-day-old domain sending an urgent DocuSign notification from the CFO routing through a 3-hop redirect behind a CAPTCHA to an organization that has no record of the sender, does that even make sense? And when you frame it that way, as a human would, the answer is no. So you would block it, then we'd automatically investigate it to give you a full case with audit trail. So you're not starting from the why am I even seeing this stage, but okay, this is real. What are the broader strategic implications? Now, if we look at the detection signals on the right, the first 4 checks, authentication, URL, content, attachment, they all pass because that's what your seg sees. So clean. The next 2, domain age, peer comparison. ML will catch some of those, but with medium confidence that gets functionally ignored. And the last 2, that intent analysis and the reasoning through the chain of all these things is only available in a reasoning architecture. So when I think about this as we evolve, as security leaders, what we should be reporting is not we blocked X million threats. The real question is what's getting through, and does your architecture have the ability to catch attacks built entirely from legitimate components? And can you explain why a specific email was blocked or let through with that explainability? That's what reasoning opens up, in terms of capabilities for you. So I do see a question. Let me look here. Let me just
Actually 2 of them.
Yeah.
One from Jeffrey and one from Austin. Yeah.
Which one's the first one, Karen?
Jeffrey, for strongest layer, does it save IT security teams time of addressing and remediating active email attacks?
Yeah, so we've done some research on this. On average, especially in organizations that struggle with false positives, they say that, and there's been several independent studies, but 20 to 30 minutes to research an alert that is a bit opaque or black box. In other words, you've got the alert, but you're not exactly sure if you buy into it or believe it. And so you have to go and then recreate it, take the URL, follow it through manually, look at the attachments, upload them to sandboxes. So we see a lot of that. We do all of that for every alert already, and it's presented in the console. So what we have designed for is taking that 20 or 30 minutes and making sure that it's always less than 2 minutes by automating all the minutia so the analysts can weigh in with their judgment and their wisdom. So we've seen, a 10x improvement on outcomes by shifting left the analysis by having the reasoning engine basically do it as it looks at every email. All right, so the question from Austin, attackers often turn off the EDR or MDR. What happens if they turn off strongest layer? Well, I think the case there is, for them to turn us off, they have to effectively have got the domain credentials to stop us from pulling in from the API, or they've gotten, a hold of our console, and gotten through the two-factor authentication and disabled it. We've got all kinds of checks and whatnot to make sure that if we ever have a loss of coverage, it's immediately notified to the admins, et cetera. But just like every other technology, if they can legitimately get us turned off, then we don't see what's going on and we can't stop it. But that we obviously put in a lot of compensating controls and architecture to make that very difficult to achieve. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So, based on my experience, I always ask I go outside the technology domain and ask the business questions. So, how do you cost justify this additional layer? And have you seen any kind of data that justifies this investment that you could present? Because obviously it's more expense. And I guess this might go to Karen on the call, but how do you guys price the product, which is always interesting for everyone to know.
Yeah, I think so I'll answer some and I'll let Karen answer a couple there. But I think when it comes to how we position ourselves, as an augmentation layer, I think it's not like, hey, you're buying a second smoke detector, right? And because we have and we're focusing on the attacks that otherwise would have got through, you got to think of us as fire suppression systems, right? When something does happen, that ability to just, take it out really quick, that's effective. And that's a different cost. Like, a smoke detector costs, $40, $50. Fire suppression systems might cost 10,000 per room, right? And I think it's a different category of risk, because if we're focusing on the things that would have gotten through that were kind of breaches in waiting, that we stop, that's a different value calculation. So I think that's one is, you're effectively catching the most advanced risks, and it's designed as a different control. But there's also the savings from a standpoint of productivity. So what we've heard in research is that false positives are often as measured as on a percent of all emails, right? So that's why people say they are 99.9, 99.99, 99.99995, of their detection rates. But they kind of hide behind that volume. And then when you ask a different question, you say, okay, what is the false positive in the alert console? Meaning, if I put 100 alerts in front of you, what percent of them are actionable versus what percent of them are wasting your time? And when you ask that question, the research says it's anywhere from 20 to 60% are not actionable alerts and are time wasters. So if you define that as false positive rate, we have a 1%, and we've measured this, we measured right in our product, a 1% false positive rate as observed in the console. So if we just say that's, to be generous, or even conservative, that's a 10x improvement on ROI. And then instead of needing 20 to 30 minutes, you need 2 minutes. That's another 10x improvement on ROI. And what you're doing is you're freeing up the capacity of a security team to focus more on strategic things than wasteful things like false positives and trying to recreate what the tool that they had came together as a verdict because you don't fully trust it. So that productivity plus the buy down of that additional risk is typically what we talk about.
Yeah, so you've got two additional questions before I get into any pricing discussion. But Jeffrey's asking, could organizations utilize an AI-powered email security solution by itself, and would it provide that coverage and prevention entirely without relying on a SEG?
Sorry, I missed part of that, Karen.
I said, could organizations utilize an AI-powered email security solution by itself, and would it provide the coverage and prevention entirely without relying on a SEG?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the answer is yes, but I don't want to underestimate the challenge of, bringing in a lot of these AI powered companies are going to be young. It's just the cohort. And so the organization's willingness to rip out something that's been in there 10 years plus to bet the farm on a new technology that was promising in a POC and is doing all the right things, our experience is that just generally doesn't happen. And so typically it's, we will come in, we'll augment, and then in the following year, there'll be a question that says, hey, do we really need to be budgeting for two of these if one could do what the other doesn't? And that's a natural conversation to have. And that's kind of how we think about it versus trying to rip and replace. But because our goal is to just get in and plug the gaps, plug the holes of the attacks getting through. So hopefully that answers the question. Karen, anything you would add?
No, I think that's exactly right. Maryland's also made a statement saying, our biggest incidents have been the result of known senders being compromised. Users trusted the email because the sender was legitimate. Links and attachments direct to a document, which then requests credentials to display the document. So maybe you want to just discuss that, which is really very common, but yeah.
That's another thing that, I think there's two elements to that, Marilyn. So that, can you trust your supply chain, right? Effectively, those are the known senders. And, that could be suppliers to just people you engage with. The challenge there is those attacks are engineered to bypass your authentication infrastructure. So that's just one of the signals, but that's why those work. And that's why you have to look at multiple signals to detect those types of compromises. But there's another problem too, which is what happens when your org has someone who's been compromised and is now, basically part of that same playbook where your org is now attacking another org. One of the things that we implemented for this very use case was the ability to scan outbound sends for malicious traffic so that we would know if one of your users somehow is doing things that would look anomalous to other organizations. We would flag that because it's becoming a very useful playbook of finding someone whose security isn't great to leverage their reputation to then make that the jump off point. So not only do we want to protect you from those types of attacks, but we want to make sure that you're not unknowingly doing it to others. And that involves being able to scan not just the inbound, but the outbound with this reasoning type approach. So hopefully that answers that. Karen, any other questions that are in chat?
I think there was just the one question that was posed around, how do we price? But Alan, you could probably answer that as well.
So listen, I think, there's the pricing model and there's where does the price sit? I would say we are, priced just like the industry, which it's per seat, and the more seats you have, there's kind of a discount rate built in. What's unique about us is we can actually do, we can deploy our protection on a sort of a per group or per email basis. So it's not the full domain. So, some organizations come to us and say, look, we only need to protect this division for now, and we can deploy it that way. So I think we have flexibility on the deployment model. And I would say, our price is competitive from a value standpoint of what we prevent, competitive to Proofpoint as the market leader. Probably a little cheaper than some of the ML ones that have higher cost models. So I would say we're not the premium, but we are anchored to the market leader because we think we detect what they miss. And then I would say the last bit I would say is we're not a billion-dollar company. We're in that stage where getting customers on our platform is more important than maximizing our profit, as the bigger sort of private equity owned security platforms are now facing. And so, we will generally work with every organization to bring them on board and be flexible in the pricing is the other part. That's not in a price book, but that's me saying as a CEO, we value getting more customers and more experience with customers than focusing too much on the top line. So hopefully it helps.
Yeah, that's great. And Jeffrey's got one question, last question as well. I think we can still squeeze it in. It's what threat intelligence does StrongestLayer leverage to identify the latest email attacks?
Yeah, so there's a lot of common feeds that folks use, that either as part of their intelligence. But I think what makes us unique is we are not dependent on threat intelligence. It's not about, all the facts that we gather are important, but the way to think about it is the counter to the threat intelligence was trying to anticipate what the bad guys are doing, and write that down in a bunch of lists that allow us to make shortcut decisions. But now that the bad guys are leveraging legitimate infrastructure, it requires a different playbook. It requires a playbook that focuses on business intelligence. Because while it's hard to know what every bad guy is doing in the shadows, what the bad guys actually are at disadvantage of is understanding your business completely. And so the more we can bring that context around the business, how it operates, who it operates with, and infuse that into the security system, it will always defeat the approximate knowledge that the bad actors have by crawling LinkedIn and Facebook and other social media posts to get a model of what your business is with prediction where you can feed in facts. And that ultimately, in this new war where they're leveraging trusted infrastructure, that's the real business intelligence that's going to power your security protection. So on that note, I will
Yep.
answer. Yes, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's go ahead. Finish up because I'll do my close and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. So, I started the presentation with a fake Rolex, the real sapphire crystal, real 904L steel, real Swiss movement, where every single component is genuine. And the only thing that's fake is the crown on the dial and the person selling it to you. A real Rolex tells a coherent story. Every part has provenance. The serial number traces back to the factory. The movement matches the case. The seller has a history. And when you look at the whole picture, the story makes sense. Now, a counterfeit has real parts, but the story doesn't add up. The 7-day-old domain sending a DocuSign from the CFO, the 3-hop redirect behind a CAPTCHA, the urgency language with no prior relationship. Each part was real, but the story clearly is not. And that's what reasoning does. It reads the full story, not just the parts. And that's how you catch the counterfeit. So 3 things that you can do right now is get the full research. We've published the complete methodology, the technique taxonomy, the data set analysis. It's at strongestlayer.com/research. Share it with your team. Email me if you have questions. I was one of the researchers on it. 2, if you want to see the reasoning engine on your own traffic, we can run a painless proof of value, proof of concept against your live environment, making no modifications other than just a reading to give you an assessment of what's getting through your current stack. You can reach out at the link on the screen or grab me after. Happy to chat about that. And then 3, if I think we went through the questions, but any else you want to know about us, just reach out. We love telling our story.
Yeah, I want to thank Alan for the presentation. And if you opted in for the additional information from Strongest Layer, we will send that information over to them so they can reach out and contact you and provide you with more information or unique scenarios that you need to have solved. Strongest Layer, I want to thank them for their support. As a quick reminder, we'll have some additional lunch and learns. And again, this year we're going to be focusing on native AI. So that products that bring a unique perspective, which clearly I hope everyone saw. And I had myself done some research on this area, and I can tell you what they bring to the table is very, very unique. And again, I want to thank Strongest Layer and Alan, and Karen, and everybody else in that team that helped bring about this presentation to CSADV, and it's being recorded. So if you want to share that recording, you'll be able to download it and send it to other members of your team. Obviously, you can reach out directly if you did not opt in. And I would also like to say there'll be some additional information in that URL link, which you should get in about 2 days, 3 days, that you can look at and see for questions that you may have or to clarify things in your mind. And again, thank you very much, Strong Slayer. It was a great presentation, and thank everybody for joining. And I'll be sending out certificates too within the next 2 weeks. So everyone, probably within the next week, everybody should have their certificates. And again, this was a very, very informative session, and I appreciate Strong Slayer for presenting it.
Wonderful.
Bye, everybody, and have a great Wednesday. Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.